Hello AP students, welcome back for another lecture on Unit 10. We're going to be discussing modules 56, 57, and 58. So, we'll be looking at the humanistic developments of personality, trait perspectives on personality development, and lastly, the socio-cognitive theory. So here are our learning targets. This is the content we're going to be discussing. So let's go ahead and dive into this unit. Okay. We have discussed this guy before. He should be familiar. We've looked at the hierarchy of needs. Okay, Abraham Maslow, one of the founders of the humanistic approach to psychology. So Maslow studied these healthy, creative people rather than troubled clinical cases. We looked at Freud last lecture and talked about kind of the individuals that he studied, people with clinical cases of neurosis, right? And came from depressed backgrounds. So Maslow instead studied a very different crowd. He proposed that we are motivated by a hierarchy of needs. This is what helps us in terms of our development and our personality and our behavior. Okay, so by this point in the 1960s, a lot of psychologists are discontent with Freud's view, psychoanalysis view of human development through this sense of determinism in which had been introduced in the sense that our future is determined by our past, right? So what we go through as children is what eventually is going to determine our adulthood will be like. And then you have behaviorists, right, who focus on personality, also somewhat determined by the environment of our childhood, and how we're raised is really the ultimate factor of who we become. While there's some truth to that, Maslow focused on this sense of the self-concept and how humanists should look more so at free will, whereas the psychoanalysis and the behaviorist approach did not look at free will. They didn't believe in free will at all, and they didn't believe that people's self-esteem mattered. They didn't believe that people's self-concept mattered. What they were feeling didn't matter. That's not what determined who they became. And so humanists brought this breath of fresh air and started looking at human personality from a different lens. Okay. So the self-concept is basically just a person's global feeling about himself or herself and how this develops throughout a person's involvement with others, right? So if we can reach this sense of high positive regard or high positive self-concept, then we'll have high self-esteem and generally have a pretty good life, okay? And this is done through free will. We can change. There is a sense of hope. We're not completely, our personality is not completely stable, but there's a sense of continuity. All right, next we have Carl Rogers, and he was really important for kind of taking Maslow's hierarchy of needs and further developing it in the sense of understanding how growth works in a healthy environment. And he said that there are three promoting climates that we need, or conditions in the climate that we need in order to develop. And kind of like think about it as a plant, right? In order for a plant to grow, it has to have proper nutrients, it has to have sun, it has to have water. So these three things here, like genuineness, acceptance, and empathy, are basically the nutrients that we need in order for our personal growth, right? So genuineness, when we feel safe, we tend to be more genuine and transparent to those around us. When we feel accepted, right? There's this sense of you mentioned like the unconditional positive regard, right? Grace, when people accept us, even amidst failure, we tend to grow. We tend to strive and thrive. And then empathy, right? When we can listen and have real empathy for others as we grow as humans, beyond this sense of selfish admiration. This is also really important for our development and personal growth. Oh yeah. So think about these two questions here for a minute, and I want you to respond to them in the comment section. All right. So first question: have you had someone in your life who accepted you unconditionally? This is related to unconditional positive regard. We're looking at caring, accepting, non-judgmental attitudes, right, that help develop our self-awareness and our self-acceptance. So don't just say yes or no here. Explain a little bit in relation to that question. What did that look like for you? And then for the second question, do you think this person helped you to know yourself better and to develop a better image of your self-concept, right? So self-concept, again, if we have a positive self-concept of ourselves, we're going to have a positive outlook on life. We're going to have a positive outlook on the world around us and other people. If we have a negative self-concept, right, of our ideal self, Rogers explained that we'll feel very dissatisfied, very unhappy, very pessimistic, very negative towards other people and towards ourselves. And so a lot of times when we are negative about the world around us, it's because we have certain insecurities within our own self, within our own ideal self. And so we take that out on others and don't see the best in other people. But I want you to just take a minute, reflect on these questions, and respond in the comment section. So looking at the trait perspective, this is also a response to the psychodynamic theorists, right? We're trying to now get a better description of what is measurable, what can we describe, what is objective, what is more empirical, right? And so you have the trait perspective. And Gordon Allport is one of the key founders of this perspective, and the sense that he's the one who defined what a trait is. So he defined it this way: a characteristic pattern of behavior to feel and act as assessed by self-reports and then peer reports, right? So let's say you're talking about these three categories here that he also developed in this theory. You've got cardinal, central, secondary. Each trait that shows up in your personality falls under one of these categories, right? Under one of these levels, according to Allport. And so cardinal is that which is dominant. Okay, your dominant, pivotal roles that show in your personality. So for instance, the first example of a trait here is honesty. Okay, so Honest Abe, okay, an American president, the 16th president of the United States of America, and the 1860s. And so we still call him Honest Abe. You know, that nickname still stuck with him. Why? Obviously because that was a dominant trait in his personality. So central level, a central trait, it's still going to be of great influence, of large influence in terms of explaining the behaviors and developing your personality. And then you have secondary traits, and that's going to be exactly how it sounds, less influence, right? So it's going to show up in certain situations, right, but less often. It's secondary. So let's say submissiveness, right? I'm not necessarily a submissive person, but put me in the specific situation, and I will be submissive, right? If it's a police officer or somebody of the law, and I'm probably gonna be a little more submissive than if it's a student, okay? Because there's a sense of authority level where I'm at with the law, right, versus a student. So that kind of goes on to explaining the three levels from Gordon Allport in terms of these traits. Next we have Raymond Cattell, and Raymond Cattell used what's called the factor analysis, a statistical approach to describe correlated or overarching variables, in this case traits, right? We talked about factor analysis in Unit 11 when you guys went through the intelligence unit, okay? Factor analysis. So this was really important. You're actually using empirical evidence and trying to really objectify personality and its studies more empirically to make it more of a science. And so Raymond Cattell took what Gordon Allport did in his research and kind of simplified it, because Gordon Allport had over 4,500 different adjectives to explain personality, and that's a lot. I mean, that's a lot of adjectives. That's kind of confusing. 4,500, right? So he used factor analysis to take on these large groups to reduce them, right, down to about 171 terms. And then eventually that would lead to fewer. You would actually get it down to 16 personality factor questionnaire, the 16 PFQ, okay, which is used to assess personalities. And so during his research, as he was using factor analysis to kind of simplify things, these overarching traits, he organized them into surface traits and then source traits, kind of like Gordon Allport with his 3 levels. Raymond Cattell had his 2 levels. He's got surface traits, source traits. So source traits are the underlying behaviors, right? The underlying traits. So we're talking about submissiveness. So submissiveness would be a source trait. A surface trait is that which we see on the surface, okay? It's the description, the observable description of the behavior. So if I see that you're being submissive, I would say, yeah, that kid just doesn't stand up for himself. He lets everybody walk all over him. He's not confident in who he is, right? So that would be the surface trait, because I'm using that on the surface to explain the underlying trait, and it's the fact that the child is submissive. Now, when looking at personality dimensions, Hans and Sybil Esnick simplified personality dimensions even further down, right? They reduced it only to 2 dimensions, right? So you got Raymond Cattell going, well, you got Gordon Allport looking at 4,500 different adjectives, super confusing, a lot of overarching themes in these traits. And then Raymond Cattell comes in, brings it down to the 16 personality factor questionnaire, right? And then you have Hans and Sybil, and they bring it all the way down to 2 dimensions, okay, to explain genetic influences of our personality, right? So they were specifically focusing on the genetic influences of our personality. Now they, like Raymond Cattell, also used factor analysis to analyze these traits and understand these dimensions of personality. And they called them temperaments, right? Rather than necessarily traits, but they looked at these temperaments of personality. And so the first one is extroversion, introversion. Okay, the second one is emotional stability, instability, right? So extroversion, introversion, we're just looking at the amount of external stimuli we need to find fulfillment and to function, properly, right? So let's go ahead and look at some of the stigmas, right, of introversion, okay, that society has placed on personalities today. So what is introversion? Well, it's not shyness, that's for sure, okay? So a lot of us are misinformed on what an introvert is. We think it's shy, we think it's like antisocial, not good in social situations, neglectful, awkward, off-putting, not fun, not exciting, very reserved, very quiet, very shy, very timid. Like, that's how we define an introvert in today's society. And that's so incorrect. An introvert is just someone who seeks lower levels of stimulation, right? Introverts can have just as much fulfillment in their lives as an extrovert. I am an introvert naturally. I enjoy being in a room by myself for hours and just reading a book, just me, a book, and a cup of coffee. I'm good, man. Or sitting on my back porch back in Kansas and looking out at the prairies and just hanging out there by myself. I love it, and I can just reflect on life and think about where I've grown and think goals and ambitions that I have and things that I want to do in life. And I love that. Like, that's where I find energy. I don't need as much stimulation. However, I love being around people. I love people. I love gatherings. I love hanging out with my friends. I love spending time with my family. I love laughing and talking about funny things or just things that I've been reading about with other people. And I like coming to class. I like our Zoom sessions that we've been doing in class. I enjoy that. I like seeing people, right? We have been so locked up in these past 4 weeks because of what's happening in Hong Kong and in the world with the coronavirus. I need some social interaction. So the Zoom sessions are kind of good for me at some stages. But so that's what an introvert is. Okay, it's not someone who's awkward and off-putting and antisocial. So that's kind of what the stigma has been portrayed as being an introvert. Is like it's a weakness today, and you should be an extrovert. You should be more social. You need to be more active. You need to be more doing more things around people and do more gatherings and put yourself out there more. And that's what I heard so much in high school and in early years of university, and it made me feel like there's something wrong with me. Like, dang, why am I not as social as them? They're so much more likable than me, because they put themselves out there more, and they're more active in social gatherings and clubs. And be who you are. All right, you can find just as much fulfillment in being an introvert as you can in being an extrovert. However, that doesn't mean be a brown recluse and lock yourself in your bedroom and play video games all day. Like, no, you still need social gatherings. But also, if you're an extrovert, like, find some time, reflect, and get away, and also understand it's important to be by yourself sometimes to really grow as an individual. So that's what an introvert is. I just wanted to cover kind of some of the stigmas and tell you a little bit about more about me and how I find fulfillment. All right, let's now look here at the Myers-Briggs, the MBTI type indicator. Okay, so the MBTI was designed by Isabel Briggs and Catherine Briggs, and they wanted to describe personality differences through these categories, right? So you got like ITSJ, ISFJ, INFJ, and you've got all these different categories, these dimensions right here, like extroversion, introversion, thinking, feeling, perceiving, judging, okay, sensing, etc. And so all these different categories were actually influenced by Neo-Freudians, specifically Carl Jung, all right, and his 8 personality philosophy or theory, right, where he focused on feeling, intuition, sensing, thinking, extroversion, introversion. And so there's not a lot of empirical data behind the MBTI, yet a lot of times we relate with it and we think, oh, this really defines me so well. But scientifically speaking, the MBTI is not a great test for indicating your personality. So yes, there are some positives. It does help us with some self-reflection. It does help us understand ourselves a little better. Gives us kind of a starting point for seeing like the differences in personality and where we might kind of fall more so, and whatnot. But it's not very scientific, and it's misused a lot today. People use it for career advising. People use it for counseling, and in terms of like marriage counseling, looking at like, are you compatible or are you not compatible? Things of this sort. For hiring purposes, managers might use it, but it's not good for that. It's actually, those are some negatives. Another thing is it's a very forced format, in the sense that if I score 9 points towards extroversion, all right, and 11 points towards introversion, I'm gonna get introversion, right? Because that's the majority there. But if I answer 1 towards extroversion and 19 towards introversion, I'm still gonna get I, but I went from 1 to 9, and it's the same measurement, so there's some inaccuracies with the MBTI in that sense too. It's a very forced format, and it categorizes you. So personally, I don't like it. Okay, next here we have the Big 5 factors. And this theory was developed by Paul Costa and Robert McCrae, in which they believed that the Esnick's personality model, right, or these 2 dimensions, was too narrow, looking only at extroversion, introversion, and emotional stability and stability, right? Which on here would be seen as neurocentric. So they decided that was too narrow, and then Allport and especially Allport, but also Raymond Cattell's 16 PFQ questionnaire was too large, and so they came up with these 5 factors to explain personality, right? More so on a continuum scale than a categorical scale seen in like the MBTI. And so you have consciousness, right? Conscientious and agreeable, neurocentric, openness, and extroversion. So we're talking about conscientious, right? This means you're usually prepared, you're usually paying attention to details, you have a schedule. Someone who's agreeable, who tends to score high on this continuum, would be somebody who takes time for others, is very helpful and interested in being there for other people. If you're neurocentric, right, you're going to be very moody if you score high on that. Okay, so you're going to be anxious, insecure, a lot of self-pity. Openness is the next one here. If you're openness, right, you spend a lot of time reflecting on things, you have a rich vocabulary, you have a wide variety of interests. And then somebody who's extroverted, sociable, fun-loving, affectionate, kind of seen as the life of the party. So these are the 5 factors. Now let's look at some popular questions related to this this theory. Okay, so first, how stable are these traits? How heritable are they? How about other cultures, right? When we're talking about these things, well, they're pretty stable. When we're talking about predispositions, we see about 50% or so is based on hereditary. And then when we look at other cultures, we see that they're pretty common from country to country across the globe. Same with emotions and facial expressions of these emotions, right? Same thing goes with personality traits. Very consistent amongst humans. Now, when we look at positives and negatives of this trait of the Big 5, major positive is that it's empirically derived, right? It was based off of the scientific method, and it's therefore much more accurate and can be used for more things than per se the MBTI, right? So this test is oftentimes used in hiring, right? For companies and businesses, they'll use the Big 5 personality test to see where you'll fit in their company, if you're good for their company, right? Do you have the proper personality traits to succeed there in their work environment? Okay, so it uses continuums rather than categories, which is great if you're trying to see like personal growth or hire people and see where they fall on that scale of being someone who's introverted and extroverted, right? I can see, oh, well, when I was in high school, I was 70% extroverted, and then I'm just making this up, and then when I was 30 years old, I was like 62% extroverted. So I've kind of changed a little bit. I've gone more towards the middle than towards the outside. So that's another thing with continuums that is very useful. Negatives, it limits our variability of these traits. So, the way I behave in some contexts could be different than the way I behave in others, right? If I'm more comfortable in one situation, I may be more extroverted in that situation. So it could limit there. Another criticism is that it neglects some key personality dimensions like humor, right? You don't really see humor mentioned in this scale when we're talking about personalities. And you also don't see altruism, or like, well, you kind of do, but you don't see religiosity in there. So 2 other personality dimensions that really aren't mentioned in the Big 5, so that's where you see some limitations. Now, another self-report assessment is the MMPI, the MMPI-2, and then you have the most recent version of this test. It's the MMPI-2RF, and that one was developed in 2008. So, and then the MMPI-2 is like when I was born, I think it was like 1989. And then the MMPI was like 30 years before that. So doesn't really matter. But anyways, these are personal inventories, okay? So they're questionnaires on which we respond to these different items, and they're designed to give a wide range of where we fall in terms of these personality traits. And so the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory Test was originally designed for clinical purposes, right? So looking at emotional disorders actually, and it had a scale in which it would measure you on which emotional disorder you fell under based on how you responded to these questions. So it was like the original test was like a 500 question test. I think they've kind of narrowed it down some to like 300 some questions. But basically you're responding to yes or no questions, true or false questions, and while it was used originally for diagnoses of psychological disorders, it's now actually used for screening tests for possible jobs, right? So maybe if you'll be a police officer, or even going into looking at college careers or compatibility in relationships, this test is actually used for that purpose as well. It's rarely inexpensive. It's pretty objective and fairly accurate compared to really any other self-report test out there. So this is a pretty solid empirically based test. Of course, there are weaknesses with it, right? You know, it's biased, right? It's a self-report assessment, so you could lie on it. You know, you could be in a certain mood one day and a different mood another day, and answer differently to these questions. So of course, like, you can't do it. It's not going to be perfect, but of the self-report assessments out there in terms of personality inventories, this is a really solid empirically based assessment. Now, the last theory we're going to discuss today is the social cognitive perspective. So Albert Bandura, really important to the development of this perspective, and we talked about him earlier on in the year. We talked about the social learning theory, observational learning, the Bobo doll experiment. Probably best known for that, but he also had some key contributions to the social cognitive perspective as well. And he believed that personality is a result of an interaction that takes place between a person and their social context, right? So while nature and nurture work together, so do individuals' traits and their situations, right? Where someone is very self-efficient and self-confident in one situation, they may not show that personality trait in another situation. Okay, so instead of only focusing on the environment that controls us, like B.F. Skinner, behavioralist, right? Social cognitive theorists are going to focus on different factors, more than one factor, not just the environment, but conditioning, observing, modeling, right? The social aspect, and then the cognitive aspect, the thinking appraisal as well, depending on the situation. All of those things holistically are going to affect a personality, a behavior that develops in an individual. Okay, Albert Bandura also believed that there were three factors that determine these patterns of behaviors, or these patterns in our personalities, okay? And these three factors is the personal, or the person, right? The behavior, and then the environment. And all of these interlocking determinants of each other have mutual influences in terms of determining our personality. So, for instance, if we look at the person, right, we're talking about internal cognitive biological processes and emotions, okay? Behavior, we're looking at actions and decisions that we actually make. And then environmental, we're looking at external stimuli and possible influences that affect our decisions. Okay, so Bandura made a model to explain this, and it was called reciprocal determinism, which basically this model is meant to explain a person's behavior, right, based on those three specific things that I just explained. So an example of this could be, let's say, Rachel thinks she's really funny, okay, and so therefore this would be related to interpersonal factors, okay. She thinks she's funny. That's a cognitive, emotional, and competent factor. All right. Next, she's going to make these judgments, and therefore leading her to join the improv team at school. Okay, so this is going to be a behavioral factor. And then in terms of this, she will join that improv team. Being on that improv team, that's going to be an environmental influence, right? That's going to lead her to make people laugh. Okay, so all of those things are related to her developing her humor. Okay, you got internal personal factors, behavioral factors, and environmental factors. So Bandura rejects Skinner's exclusive emphasis on only environment. Instead, he believes that a person's thinking, cognition, prior learning, and the environment and the social context all influence our behavior and determine our personality. So when evaluating the social cognitive perspective, critics say just this, right? Cognitive psychologists, social cognitive psychologists pay a lot of attention to the situation, right? The external environment, the social environment. However, they pay very little attention to the individual, okay? They don't focus much on the unconscious mind, and they fail to look at the emotions, they fail to look at the true traits, and the genetic influences, right? The biology. It's very important in understanding holistically why a human does what they do and why they behave the way that they behave. So you can't fail to appreciate the person's inner traits, and you can't fail to appreciate the biological aspects either. So these are some of the criticisms that you see within this approach or this perspective. All right, here's our last question for today. I want you to reflect on this. Here's the EQ, the essential question. Explain how understanding personality theories can help explain and improve your understanding of yourself and others. So it's kind of just a review of this unit, looking at these 5 specific perspectives. You got the psychoanalytic, psychodynamic, humanistic, trait theories, and the social cognitive theory. I want you guys to reflect, pick 3 of these 5 theories, and answer how understanding personality theories can help explain or improve the understandings of ourselves and others. All right, that's it for today. We'll see you next time.